I believe he's my father. Everyone can see that I look exactly like him, so whatever the paper says, the mirror doesn't lie. The records were made by people who work for this family. I'm talking about people who have nothing to do with this family. Dear God, please let the results be right. I know I'm his son. I need the paper to catch up with the truth.
The first thing Ri-so did on the morning of his 6th birthday was walk into his parents' bedroom, climb onto the bed between them, fold his small arms across his chest, and say, "Appa, I've been patient. You promised Korea. I'm 6 now. A deal is a deal." Neji opened one eye. "You're 6 years old. You don't know what a deal is." "I know what a promise is," Ri-so said. "And I know you made one." Valentina laughed into her pillow, and Ri-so pointed at her without looking. "Don't laugh, Yama. You wanted to go too. Don't let him think you're on his side." "I'm always on your side, baby." "Good." Ri-so nodded, satisfied, then looked back at his father with the expression of a man who has already won an argument and is simply waiting for the other party to accept it. "Korea. Easter. You, me, and Yama. You promised in front of God." Neji sat up slowly, rubbing his face. He hadn't been to Korea in 11 years. 11 years of deliberately building a life so full and so permanent that going back would feel unnecessary. He had his company. He had his penthouse in Atlanta. He had Valentina, who made every morning worth waking up for. He had this child, this ridiculous, brilliant child who negotiated like a 60-year-old attorney and cried at animated movies and still asked to sleep with the lights on even though he told everyone he wasn't afraid of anything. He had everything he needed. Korea was the one place that had never needed him back. But Ri-so was looking at him with those eyes, the eyes that were almost exactly like his own, dark and patient and unafraid of silence, and Neji felt the wall he'd spent a decade building begin to shift slightly on its foundation. "Okay," he said finally. Ri-so pumped his fist. "I knew it. I told God you'd say yes. You told God. We talk every night." Ri-so said it with complete seriousness, already sliding off the bed. He said to keep asking. I kept asking. See how that works? He disappeared down the hallway before either of his parents could respond, and Neji sat in the quiet that followed, staring at the space where his son had just been. Valentina shifted closer and laid her head on his shoulder. She didn't say anything for a moment. She had always understood when words were unnecessary. It was one of the first things he'd loved about her. She was the kind of woman who could sit with you in silence and make the silence feel like something warm. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," she said eventually. "I promised him." "You've been promising him for 2 years. He survived the delays." She looked up at him. "I just want you to go because you want to. Not because a 6-year-old trapped you." Neji was quiet for a long moment. "My father doesn't know I have a family." Valentina went still. "I know. He's going to find out when we land." "I know that too." "You're not worried?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything, not quickly, not dismissively, but with that deliberate attention that made him feel, every time, like whatever he said actually mattered. "I'm not worried about you," she said. "I'm a little worried about Ri-so. He's going and expecting grandparents who will love him, and we don't know what we're walking into." Neji thought about his father, Ne-sung. About the woman his father had married after his mother died, a woman named Jang Yun-suk, who had appeared in his father's life before the grief had even settled, who had reorganized everything around herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been planning it for a long time. He thought about his 2 half-siblings he'd never met, children born from a marriage he'd refused to acknowledge, carrying a name he'd spent years trying to make mean something different. "Ri-so will be fine," he said. "He survived you telling him he couldn't have dessert before dinner for 6 straight years. He's stronger than both of us." Valentina laughed, and he pulled her close, pressing his lips to her forehead, holding her there a beat longer than necessary. He almost didn't go. Standing at the departure gate 3 weeks later with Ri-so attached to his hand like a living anchor and Valentina pulling both their carry-ons, he almost turned around. Something in his chest pulled in a direction he couldn't name, some animal instinct that had kept him safe for 11 years by keeping him away. But Ri-so looked up at him from below, grinning with his 2 front teeth missing, and said, "Appa, your face looks scared. Do you want me to hold your other hand too?" Neji stared at his son. "I'm not scared. It's okay if you are. I'm a little nervous too. But I told God that on the plane." Riso's voice dropped confidentially. He said it would all work out. I believe him. Neji looked at this child. This 6-year-old who spoke to God on planes and negotiated with adults and cried privately when he thought no one was watching. This child who had his eyes, his jaw, the precise way he set his mouth when he'd made a decision. He picked up his carry-on. They boarded the plane. They landed in Seoul on a Thursday afternoon, and Neji's father was waiting at the house in Hanamdong because Neji had called ahead. Not to warn him. Just to give the old man the dignity of not being ambushed, even if he hadn't extended the same courtesy 11 years ago. Naesung came out of the house when the car pulled in and stopped on the steps when he saw them. He was older. Obviously, 11 years older, but it sat differently on him than Neji expected, heavier somehow, as though something had taken up residence behind his eyes and was using up his light. Jang Yun-suk appeared in the doorway behind him. Then 2 teenagers, a girl and a boy, Neji's half-siblings, who had his father's cheekbones but none of his stillness. Riso stepped out of the car, looked up at the house, looked at the people on the steps, and then looked back at his father. "Which one is Halabia? The tall one." Riso studied Naesung for a moment with the careful assessment of someone doing a very important calculation. Then he walked forward, hands in his pockets, spine straight, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I'm Ne Riso," he said in Korean that Valentina had been teaching him for 2 years. "I've been waiting to meet you for a long time." Naesung stared down at the child. The color had left his face completely. Jang Yun-suk made a sound behind him, something between a word and a gasp. Because the child standing in front of them looked exactly like the Ne family. The jaw, the eyes, the particular way he held his shoulders. He was unmistakably, undeniably theirs, in bone and blood and bearing. Which was impossible, because Neji couldn't have a child. The silence stretched so long that Riso tilted his head, still calm, still waiting, and said, "You can hug me if you want. I don't mind." Naesung descended the steps slowly, knelt in front of the boy, and looked at his face for a very long time. Then he looked up at Neji, who had come to stand just behind his son, and his expression held something complicated and breaking, something Neji hadn't seen on his father's face since the day they buried his mother. "He's yours." Naesung's voice was barely sound. "He's mine," Neji said. And that was the moment everything started. Not with warmth, not with reunion, but with Jang Yun-suk's voice cutting across the courtyard like something sharp and precise. "That's not possible." Valentina, who had been standing quietly beside the car, watching everything with those careful eyes of hers, turned her head slowly toward the woman in the doorway. Riso turned too. He looked at Jang Yun-suk for a long moment, then turned back to his grandfather. "Who is she?" he asked, with the particular neutrality of a child who has already taken a measurement and doesn't need to say it out loud. Naesung stood up slowly from where he'd been kneeling in front of Riso, and something shifted in his posture as he turned to face his wife. It was subtle, the kind of shift that only people who had been watching someone for years would notice. Valentina noticed it. She filed it away quietly. "Yun-suk," Naesung said, with a tone that was neither warm nor cold, but carried the weight of a man who had said that name too many times in too many difficult moments. "Come inside." Jang Yun-suk didn't move immediately. Her eyes were still on Riso, moving over the child's face with an expression Valentina couldn't fully read, calculation dressed as concern, curiosity wearing the mask of confusion. She was an elegant woman, precisely put together in the way of someone who had decided long ago that appearance was armor and had never stopped sharpening it. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking," Yun-suk said, her voice softened now, almost gentle. "Gee, you know your condition. We've all known since you were small." "So how?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Neji said. His voice was level. Valentina recognized that voice. It was the one he used when he was very carefully not reacting to something. "Your condition," Yun-suk repeated, stepping down one step. The doctors were very clear. Your father and I have all the records. You're not my mother, Neji said. You have no records of mine. The two teenagers on the steps exchanged a glance. The girl, who was maybe 16, leaned slightly toward her brother. Neither of them spoke. Naesung turned to his wife and said something in a low, firm voice that Valentina couldn't catch, and Yun-suk finally stepped back inside. The door didn't close fully. Valentina watched the shadow behind it stay exactly where it was. She reached down and took Ri-so's hand. He squeezed hers once, the way he always did when he knew she needed steadying, even though he was 6 and she was the parent, even though it should have been the other way around. Ri-so had always been that kind of child, the kind who sensed the shape of a room before he walked fully into it. Yama, he said quietly, looking up at her. That lady doesn't like us. We just got here, baby. Give it time. I gave it 30 seconds, he said. That's enough time. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Dinner that first night was the careful, exhausting performance of people who have things to say and have collectively decided not to say them yet. The food was good. The conversation was surface. Naesung asked about Neji's company with the stilted pride of a man who followed his son's career from a distance and wanted credit for paying attention. The two half-siblings, whose names were Ne Yura and Ne Hyun, watched Ri-so with the fascinated uncertainty of people who had just been presented with a fact that didn't fit the story they'd been told. Ri-so ate his rice, answered every question directed at him with complete composure, and at one point looked across the table at Yun-suk and said, politely, "You didn't eat your vegetables." "My mom says vegetables are important." Yun-suk stared at him. "I'm just sharing information," Ri-so added. "You can do what you want. It's your body." Valentina pressed her lips together and looked at her plate. Neji brought his glass to his mouth to hide whatever was happening on his face. Naesung made a sound that might have been a suppressed cough. Yun-suk smiled, the way a person smiles when they are storing something to use later. That night, after Ri-so had fallen asleep in the guest room with his small hand tucked under his cheek and his sneakers placed neatly beside the bed, because Valentina had taught him to do that, and he did it everywhere now, she and Neji stood on the balcony of their room and looked out over Seoul. The city was loud and bright and indifferent to them, which felt honest. "What condition?" Valentina asked. Neji was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "I've never been told anything about a condition." "But you knew she wasn't lying." He turned to look at her. His face in the low light was the face she knew better than any other face in the world, the jaw she'd pressed her hand against on their wedding night, the eyes she'd looked into the morning Ri-so was born and understood, with a completeness that she'd never managed to put into words, that this was her life now and she was glad. He said nothing, which was the only answer she needed. She reached out and took his hand. "Whatever it is, we face it together." "Val." "Whatever it is," she repeated quietly. "Together." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. She felt him squeeze her hand, and then she felt him let go, and she understood that too. Some things he needed to carry alone first before he could let her help with the weight. She had learned over 6 years that pressing him before he was ready only made him go further inside himself. So she let him go inside first. What she didn't know was that inside their room, while she stayed on the balcony a few minutes longer looking at the city, Neji opened his phone and called a man named Dr. Tae-woo, who had been his grandmother's personal physician in America and the only doctor he'd ever fully trusted, and asked a question in a voice so quiet it was almost not a voice at all. "Is it possible," he said, "that there was something my grandmother never told me?" Dr. Tae-woo was silent for a beat too long. And that pause, that single second of hesitation from a man who had never hesitated once in 11 years of answering his calls, told Neji everything. The next morning, Ri-so woke before everyone, put on his shoes, went downstairs, and found his grandfather sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the expression of a man thinking very hard about something he couldn't solve. Ri-so climbed into the chair across from him, folded his hands on the table, and said, "You knew my dad's condition before we came here?" Naesung looked at him. "Who told you about that?" "Nobody. I heard things last night." Ri-so was matter-of-fact. "I'm 6, not deaf." The old man stared at his grandson. The child stared back. Is it serious? Riso asked. It depends on what you believe. I believe my dad is my dad, Riso said simply. I look exactly like him. Everyone can see that. So whatever the papers say, the mirror doesn't lie. He paused. That's something my mom told me. I think she was talking about character. But it works here too. Naesung set down his cup. His hands, Riso noticed, were not entirely steady. You're very wise for a 6-year-old, his grandfather said. I know. Riso wasn't being arrogant. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without apology. I'm also hungry. Do you have cereal? My dad never buys the good kind. He only buys the healthy stuff. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. It tastes like sadness. Naesung blinked. Then, slowly, something that had been locked in his face for a very long time began to move toward the surface. He laughed. Not politely. Not carefully. A real laugh, the kind that surprises the person doing it, the kind that sounds like something returning from a long absence. Riso watched him, satisfied. I knew you had one of those, he said. Your laugh sounds like my dad's. Did you know that? The old man stopped laughing and looked at the boy again, and this time the thing in his face wasn't locked anymore. It was wide open and slightly broken and fully present. No, Naesung said softly. I didn't know that. Upstairs, in his room, Neji sat on the edge of the bed with his grandmother's letter in his hands. He had found the combination in a note left with her lawyer to be released on his 45th birthday, but the lawyer had called yesterday when he'd landed in Seoul and said, in a voice that carried the discomfort of someone delivering delayed pain, that there had been a secondary instruction. If Neji ever returned to Korea, the letter was to be opened immediately. He sat with it now, the envelope thin and soft from years of waiting, his grandmother's handwriting on the front, her particular careful cursive that had written his name on birthday cards and grocery lists and permission slips for school. He opened it. He read it. And when he finished, he sat very still for a very long time. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the courtyard where Riso was now kicking a small stone along the path, talking to himself the way he did when he was working something out. Small and sturdy and entirely unaware that the ground his father was standing on had just shifted completely. The letter said 3 things. The first was that she loved him. His grandmother had written it the way she said everything, without decoration, without build-up, just the plain fact of it placed at the beginning so he would carry it through everything that followed. I love you, G. Everything I did because of that love. I need you to believe that before you read the rest. The second was that she had known about the diagnosis since he was 4 years old. That Naesung had sent the medical records to her after the family doctors delivered their findings, partly as explanation, partly as justification for why he had gone on to remarry, why he had built a second family, why he had let his first wife, Neji's mother, carry the weight of a failing marriage without ever telling her the real reason it was failing. The family had decided that Neji's condition was the reason for everything. The convenient reason. The reason that explained all the decisions they'd made without implicating anyone's character. His grandmother had deliberately kept it from him. She had watched him grow into a man, watched him fall in love, watched him marry Valentina, and she had said nothing. Because she believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived enough to trust her own instincts, that the diagnosis had been wrong from the beginning. She had never believed it. She had watched her daughter carry a healthy pregnancy. She had held Neji in the delivery room and looked at a child who was everything a child should be, strong lungs, clear eyes, full of life, and she had refused, in her bones, to accept that something fundamental was broken in him. She had spent years quietly gathering second opinions from doctors who had never met the Ney family and had no reason to protect them. Every single one had told her the same thing. There was nothing in Neji's blood work, nothing in his physiology, that supported the original diagnosis. The third thing the letter said was this: I don't know who told that first lie, G. But I know it came from inside that house. I know it served someone's purpose. And I know that when you read this, you will already be back in Korea, because that is the only condition under which this letter reaches you early. So go carefully. And trust Valentina. She is the truest thing you have ever chosen. He folded the letter, put it in his inside jacket pocket, close to his chest, stood at the window for another full minute, watching his son move around the courtyard below, and then he straightened his spine and went downstairs. Valentina was already in the kitchen when he arrived. She had made coffee, found the cups herself, and was leaning against the counter with the quiet confidence of a woman who made herself at home in unfamiliar spaces not out of comfort, but out of refusal to be made to feel like a guest in her own life. Ri-so was at the table eating cereal that his grandfather had apparently produced from a high cabinet with the careful ceremony of a man who had been waiting a long time to feed someone. Neji looked at his father. Nae-sung looked back at him, and for a moment, the kitchen held something enormous and unspoken between them. "We need to talk," Neji said. "Yes," his father said. "We do. Not this morning." Neji poured himself coffee, stood beside his wife. "Tonight. After Ri-so is in bed." His father nodded. Ri-so looked between them both with the attention of a child who understood that something important was happening and was cataloging it carefully for later. Then he looked down at his cereal and said, to no one in particular, "This one tastes like actual food." "Thank you, Halabia-ji." Nae-sung smiled, and it was the smile of a man being offered something he didn't know he was still eligible for. The day passed with the uneasy brightness of a sky before weather. Yun-suk was present at lunch, composed and pleasant in the way that Valentina recognized as performance, the smile calibrated, the conversation directed carefully away from anything that mattered. She asked about Atlanta. She asked about Valentina's work, and Valentina answered simply that she ran an interior design firm, and Yun-suk nodded with the exact expression of someone mentally filing that information under a category Valentina didn't want to think about. Yura, the 16-year-old half-sister, was easier. She was fascinated by Ri-so in the helpless way of teenagers who pretend not to care about small children and then get completely dismantled by them. By afternoon, she was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor playing a card game Ri-so had invented on the spot with rules that changed every 3 turns, and she was losing spectacularly and fully committed to winning. Hyun, the 14-year-old boy, was quieter. He watched Neji with something that was half resentment and half something Valentina thought might actually be longing, the expression of someone who had grown up hearing a name attached to a legend and didn't know what to do now that the legend had a face. That evening, after Ri-so had been bathed and read to and put to bed, after Valentina had sat with him until his breathing slowed and his small fist uncurled against the pillow, she came back downstairs to find Neji and his father in the study with the door half open and Yun-suk nowhere visible. She almost walked past. Then she heard her husband's voice say, "Tell me the truth about the diagnosis," and she stopped. Nae-sung's answer was long and careful and arrived at the truth the way guilty things always do, sideways, through explanation and context and justification, circling the actual fact without landing on it until there was nowhere left to go. He said the diagnosis had come from the family's medical team. He said he had believed it. He said that at the time, with Neji's mother struggling and the family business requiring his attention and the pressure of his own father bearing down on him about an heir, he had made decisions he was not proud of. "You believed it," Neji said flatly. "I believed it," Nae-sung said. "I had no reason not to. The doctors were your doctors. Your family's doctors. On your family's payroll." A pause. Long enough to be its own answer. "Who told them what to write?" Neji asked. His father said nothing. "Who benefited from you believing I could never have a child?" Neji's voice was quiet and entirely without emotion, which Valentina had learned was the most dangerous version of him. "Who in this house needed me to carry that diagnosis?" She heard her father-in-law exhale. She heard him say, "Gee, it was a long time ago." "Whatever happened?" "Ri-so is my son," Neji said. "I need you to understand what I'm saying. He is my son. And someone in this family has spent 30 years making sure I would never believe that." In the study, Nae-sung went very still. Valentina stepped back from the doorway and pressed her back against the wall. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, something between grief and fury and a love so fierce it frightened her. She had never cheated on her husband. Not once, not in thought, not in action. She had loved him with everything she had, and she had given him a son who was his from the first breath, and somewhere in this house was a person who had tried to use medicine and paperwork to turn that truth into a lie. She heard a small sound behind her. She turned. Riso was standing in the hallway in his pajamas, holding his stuffed bear, his feet bare on the cold floor. He had clearly been there for some time. His face was very still, and his eyes were very bright, and Valentina recognized the particular stillness of a child who is working very hard not to cry. She crossed to him immediately, crouching down. "Baby, you're supposed to be asleep." "I heard Appa's voice," he said quietly. He sounded like he was hurting. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, and he let her hold him for exactly 3 seconds before he straightened up with the dignity of a child who has decided that someone needs to be strong right now and he is available for the position. "Yama," he said. "Is it the condition thing? Is that why Appa has been looking at me differently since yesterday?" Valentina went still against him. "I'm not stupid," Riso said. "I'm 6, but I'm not stupid. He keeps looking at me like he's trying to decide something. He never used to look at me like that." His voice was steady, but just barely. "I'm his son. He knows that, right? He can see it. I look exactly like him." "He knows," Valentina said, because she believed it. Because she had to. "Then why does he look scared of me?" She didn't have an answer for that. She held her son tighter instead, her face pressed to his forehead, while her eyes were burning and her jaw was locked against everything she was feeling. Riso patted her back 3 times. "Don't cry, Yama. I talked to God last night. I told him the whole situation." He pulled back to look at her with complete seriousness. He said to hold on. She looked at her son's face. This child who prayed over family problems with the focused urgency of a small lawyer preparing a case. This child who patted her back when she was falling apart and told her to hold on. This child who had his father's eyes and his father's jaw and his father's particular way of holding his shoulders like nothing in the world could move him. "Okay," she whispered. "We hold on." "Good." He took her hand. "Now walk me back to bed. The floor is cold and I forgot my socks." She walked him back. She tucked him in. She sat in the chair beside his bed until his breathing deepened, and just before he fell asleep, he said, almost too quiet to hear, "God, it's me again. Please hurry. I think everyone is running out of time." She sat in the dark a long time after that. The DNA test was Neji's idea, and he did it alone. He didn't tell Valentina. He didn't tell his father. He woke at 5 in the morning 3 days into their visit, collected a hair sample from Riso's pillow with the careful movements of a man doing something he both needed to do and couldn't fully justify to himself. And he drove to a private clinic in Gangnam that his company's legal team used for confidential matters. He sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes with his hands in his lap and his face completely neutral and his chest doing something he hadn't felt since he was a child sitting outside his mother's hospital room, that specific. Terrible waiting that is less about hope and more about bracing. He drove back to the house before anyone woke up. He sat in the parked car for a while, looking at the front door. Then he went inside and made breakfast and was standing at the stove when Riso appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30, bare under one arm, face still soft with sleep, and said, "Appa, you're making eggs." "I'm making eggs. Can I have mine scrambled?" "You always have yours scrambled." "I know. I just like it when you confirm it." Riso climbed onto the stool at the kitchen counter and watched his father cook with the easy, proprietary comfort of a child who had watched this exact scene hundreds of times. "You were up early." "Couldn't sleep." "I sleep fine," Riso offered. "My brain turns off fast." "Yama says it's a gift." He paused. "She says your brain never fully turns off. She says it's why you're good at business and difficult at vacations." Neji plated the eggs without responding. "She means it as a compliment," Riso added generously. "Mostly." Neji set the plate in front of his son and leaned on the counter across from him, watching the child eat with the focus of someone memorizing something. Riso ate 3 bites before he looked up and said, "Why are you staring at me?" "I'm not staring. You're doing the face." What face? Riso put down his fork and reproduced the expression with startling accuracy, brow slightly furrowed, eyes steady, jaw set, the exact look of a man trying to solve an equation that refuses to balance. Neji stared at his own expression on his son's face. You do it when something is bothering you, Riso said, picking his fork back up. I do it too, Yama says. She says we make the exact same face, and it scares her a little. He ate another bite. She says it's because we're the same person at different sizes. Neji said nothing. I don't mind the staring, Riso said. Just so you know, you can look at me as much as you want. I'm not going anywhere. Something moved through Neji's chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He turned back to the stove. The results came back 4 days later. He was in the garden when the notification arrived on his phone. He read the report twice, then a third time, the way you read something when the words are clear but the meaning refuses to land. Negative. The probability of paternity was below the threshold for biological relation. The test was definitive. He was not Riso's biological father. He sat on the garden bench for a long time. Around him, Seoul moved through its morning with complete indifference. Birds. Traffic. The sound of Riso's voice somewhere inside the house, explaining something to Yura with the patient authority of a child who has found an audience. Neji put his phone in his pocket. He did not go inside immediately. He sat with it, the way his grandmother had taught him to sit with difficult things, fully, without running, until he understood the shape of what he was carrying. She had told him once that the worst thing about pain was not the pain itself, but the sprinting away from it, the way people injured themselves worse trying to escape than they would have if they'd just stood still and let the thing pass through. He sat still. What passed through was not what he expected. He had braced for rage. He had expected the cold, clarifying fury that had carried him through every professional crisis, every betrayal in business, every moment someone had underestimated him and paid for it. He had expected to feel like a man who had been made a fool of. Instead, what moved through him was grief, not anger. Grief, low and heavy and shapeless, the kind that has no object, that doesn't know where to point itself. Because the child inside that house was still the child who had negotiated Korea on his 6th birthday. Still the child who talked to God on planes. Still the child who made his exact face back at him this morning at the breakfast counter and told him he wasn't going anywhere. The DNA report said one thing. Every other evidence in the world said something else. He didn't know which one to believe, and that not knowing was the most frightening thing he had felt in his adult life. He began to pull away from Valentina slowly, in the careful way of someone who doesn't want to be caught doing it. He answered her questions fully. He came to bed at the right time. He sat across from her at dinner and responded when she spoke and did not, in any moment he could identify, behave like a man who was falling apart. But Valentina knew. She had loved him for 7 years. She had learned his silences the way musicians learn rests, not as absence, but as part of the composition, necessary, intentional, weighted. And this silence was different. This silence had a shape she hadn't encountered before, something guarded inside it, something that was not resting but watching. He looked at her sometimes and then looked away too quickly. He touched her less, not dramatically, not in a way she could point to, but she felt the subtle withdrawal the way you feel a room cooling, gradually, before you can prove the temperature has changed. She didn't know what had happened. She went over the days carefully, looking for what she might have said, what she might have done, whether she had missed something that would explain the distance growing between them like something slow and geographic. She found nothing. She was sitting with Riso in the courtyard on a Tuesday afternoon, watching him build an elaborate obstacle course for a beetle he had found and named Zhongpao, when her son looked up at her and said, "Yama, did you and Appa fight?" "No, baby." Riso watched the beetle navigate a twig barrier. "He's being weird. He has things on his mind." "What things?" "Grown-up things." Riso considered this. "Is it the condition thing still?" "Riso." "Because if it is," he continued, redirecting the beetle gently with one finger, "I think someone should just take a test. A real test. At a real hospital. Not whatever the family doctors say." He looked up. I heard Halabia talking to someone on the phone last night about records. Old records. He sounded worried. Valentina stared at her son. I wasn't eavesdropping, Riso said defensively. I was going to get water. The kitchen is next to the study. Sound travels. He paused. Yama, I'm his son. I know I am. He knows it too. He just got scared because somebody put a lie in his head a long time ago. His voice was very steady. We need to prove it. Properly. Without anyone from this family involved. She looked at this child. 6 years old, sitting in a Korean courtyard with a beadle named Jong Pal, calmly outlining a strategy for dismantling a decades-long deception. How do you know so much? She asked softly. Riso shrugged with one shoulder. I pay attention. Then, more quietly, and I pray a lot. God's been talking back lately. She reached out and touched his face. He let her, for exactly as long as he felt was appropriate, then turned back to his beetle. That evening, Riso found his father on the balcony. Neji heard the door and turned, and Riso walked out and stood beside him and looked at the city and said nothing for a full minute, which was a very long time for Riso to be quiet. Appa, he said finally. I know you're confused about something. He kept his eyes on the city. I'm not going to ask you what it is. But I need to say something and I need you to hear it. He turned and looked directly at his father. I am your son. I don't need a paper to tell me that. You don't need a paper either. You know me. You've always known me. He put his small hand briefly on his father's arm, a gesture so adult and so deliberate that Neji felt it move through him like something electric. But if the paper is the thing that's making you scared, then let's fix the paper. Me and Iyama will fix it. You don't have to do anything. He removed his hand. Also, he added, his voice shifting back to its normal register, you haven't smiled at Iyama in 4 days. That's too long. She hasn't said anything, but I've been counting. He looked back at the city. She's the best person either of us knows. Don't make her feel like she did something wrong when she didn't. Neji stood very still. That's all I wanted to say, Riso said. Good night. He went inside. Neji stood on the balcony alone for a long time after that, the city lights spreading out below him, his son's words sitting in his chest like something that had finally, after days of searching, found the exact place it belonged. The next morning, Riso woke up with a plan. He had been thinking about it since the balcony conversation, turning it over during the hours he was supposed to be sleeping, refining it the way he refined everything, quietly, systematically, without announcing the process until the conclusion was ready. He had asked God about it before he fell asleep, not for permission exactly, more for confirmation that the direction was right. He felt confirmed. He went to his mother first. Valentina was at the vanity doing her hair when he appeared in the doorway, studied her for a moment, and said, Yama, I think you should change your hair. She looked at him in the mirror. Good morning to you too. Good morning. He came and stood beside her, examining her reflection with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. I think you should do something different. Something that makes you feel powerful. The kind of hair that says, I'm not worried about anything. I'm not worried about anything. Your hair doesn't know that. He tilted his head. There's a salon near the market. Halabia said it's very good. I think we should go. Riso. I'll pay, he said. She blinked. You don't have money. He reached into the pocket of his pajama pants and produced his father's black card with the calm precision of a magician completing a trick. He set it on the vanity. Valentina stared at it. Where did you get that? Appa left it on the nightstand. He was completely untroubled by this. He's still your husband. His money is your money. And your money is technically also mine since I'm the child and children are dependents. He paused. I looked that up. You looked up financial dependence. I look up many things. He picked up the card and held it out to her. Come on. New hair, new energy. Appa needs to remember that you're the most beautiful woman he knows, and sometimes men need a visual reminder because they get distracted by their feelings. Valentina looked at her son for a long moment. Did God tell you that too? No, that one is just me. He said it without arrogance, just as plain observation. I've been watching him look at you when he thinks nobody sees. He still looks at you the way he always looked at you. He's just scared right now. Scared men need to be reminded of what they're about to lose. He set the card down firmly. Salon. Today. I'll tell Appa we're going shopping after. Riso, you can't just take his card and… After all, Riso said, moving toward the door with the air of someone who has concluded a meeting, he's still your husband. The card works until he's not. He stopped and turned back, completely serious. And I'm making sure he stays your husband. So technically I'm protecting his own investment. He left before she could respond. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Then she picked up the card. They went to the salon. Riso sat in the waiting area with his bear and a magazine he couldn't read and the expression of a man supervising an important operation. When the stylist finished and Valentina turned to look at herself, her hair swept back from her face in a way that was simple and clean and entirely confident. Riso stood up, walked around her once, and nodded. Yes, he said. That's the one. You think. Appa is going to forget what he was worried about for at least 5 minutes. He took her hand. Now we shop. I saw a scarf in a window near here that you would like. You saw a scarf. Dark green. Your color. He was already walking. Come on. They spent 2 hours moving through the market near the house, Riso leading with absolute confidence, occasionally consulting his father's card with the expression of a man reviewing his budget. Selecting things with the decisive efficiency of someone who had been shopping for women his entire life, which, given that it had been 6 years and he'd spent most of them accompanying Valentina, was not entirely inaccurate. He bought her the scarf. He bought her a small painting from a street vendor because he said the colors looked like her laugh, which made Valentina stop walking completely for a moment. He bought himself a keychain shaped like a tiger because he felt it represented his personality, and he bought his father a very serious-looking pen. Why does Appa get a pen? Valentina asked. Because he needs to sign things, Riso said. Important things. Documents. Correct results. He said the last part quietly, almost to himself, and Valentina felt something cold move through her chest. When they returned to the house, Neji was in the front room with his father and Yun-suk, all 3 of them arranged in the careful configuration of people mid-discussion who have gone quiet at an interruption. Riso walked in ahead of Valentina, set the shopping bags down, and positioned himself in the center of the room with the bearing of someone calling a meeting to order. Neji looked up. His eyes went to Valentina. They stayed there. Riso watched his father's face with the focused attention of a scientist monitoring an experiment. He saw exactly what he'd predicted. The fear didn't disappear, it was too big and too rooted for a haircut and a green scarf to dissolve it completely. But for 4 full seconds, his father looked at his mother the way he had always looked at her, like she was the specific answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. 4 seconds was enough for now. Riso looked at Yun-suk. She was watching Valentina with an expression that had nothing warm in it, something calculating and quietly hostile, the kind of look that existed in the space between what you said and what you meant. He had seen that expression before. He had seen it on the first day when she'd said that's not possible about him with a certainty that didn't come from surprise. People who are truly surprised don't sound certain. They sound confused. Yun-suk had sounded certain. Riso stored that observation in the place where he kept things he wasn't ready to use yet. Appa, he said. Neji pulled his eyes from Valentina. I used your card. A beat. I noticed it was gone. I bought Iyama a scarf. And a painting. And myself a keychain. He held up the tiger. I also got you a pen. You can sign things with it. He placed the pen on the table beside his father with ceremony. You're welcome. Neji looked at the pen. Then at his son. You took my card without asking. You were asleep. I was in the next room. You seemed busy. Riso was unruffled. After all, you're still Yama's husband. Your card is basically also her card. I was facilitating. From the corner, Nae-sung made a sound. Yun-suk turned to look at him sharply. Additionally, Riso continued, looking directly at his father. I've been thinking about the situation. He said the situation with the gravity of a man referring to a geopolitical crisis. I have a proposal. A proposal, Neji repeated. 3 hospitals, Riso said. Not family doctors. Not anyone connected to anyone in this house. 3 completely separate hospitals in Seoul. Me and Yama will choose them. You don't have to come. He looked at his father steadily. But you have to agree to accept whatever 3 independent hospitals tell you. All 3. No arguing with the results. The room had gone very quiet. Yun-suk stood up. This is completely unnecessary. The records have been. The records, Riso said, turning to look at her with an expression that was entirely too old for his face, were made by people who worked for this family. He let that sit for a moment. I'm talking about people who have nothing to do with this family. Yun-suk opened her mouth. I'm 6, Riso said preemptively, but I'm not confused about how conflicts of interest work. Valentina pressed her hand over her mouth. Neji was staring at his son. Appa. Riso's voice dropped, and underneath the composure there was something raw and real and very young. I know what you're thinking. I've known for days. And I'm not angry at you for it, because someone put something in your head that was never true. But I need you to let us fix it. He held his father's gaze. I am your son. Let me prove it the right way. The silence lasted a long time. Then Neji said, very quietly, 3 hospitals. 3 hospitals, Riso confirmed. You and your mother choose them. Yes. I accept the results. All 3. Neji looked at his son for a long moment, and his face held something enormous and barely contained. Okay, he said. Okay. Riso nodded once. Then he picked up his tiger keychain, tucked it in his pocket, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, turned back, and looked at his father. Also, he said, you should tell your family to back off Yama. The way that lady looks at her is not respectful. He glanced briefly at Yun-suk without accusation, just plain statement of fact. If you can't handle that, I will start looking for a replacement husband for Yama. I already have some ideas. Riso, Valentina started. There's no man alive, Riso said with absolute conviction, who would turn down the chance to be the father of someone as exceptional as me. So you should consider your position carefully, Appa. He paused. I love you. But I love Yama more. Act accordingly. He walked out. The room was completely silent. Then Ne-sung slowly began to laugh. A deep, helpless, genuine laugh that bent him slightly forward. Valentina turned away because she was about to join him and she didn't want Yun-suk to see it. Neji sat very still, looking at the doorway his son had just walked through, and on his face was an expression that had nothing complicated in it at all. Just love. Wide open, uncomplicated, completely undone love, the kind that doesn't ask questions and doesn't need papers, and has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with 6 years of a person choosing you every single morning. Yun-suk left the room without a word. Nobody watched her go. That night, alone in his room, after his parents thought he was asleep, Riso knelt beside his bed in the dark with his hands folded and his bear sitting upright beside him as witness. God, he whispered, it's me. The 3 hospitals were my idea, but you gave me the courage. So that's yours. I just want to say thank you in advance for what I already believe is coming. He was quiet for a moment. Please let the results be right. Please let them be true. I know I'm his son. I've always known. I just need the paper to catch up with the truth. His voice dropped smaller. And please protect my mom. She hasn't cried in front of me, but I hear her sometimes at night. She's too strong for her own good. Just hold her, okay? She needs help even when she won't ask for it. He climbed back into bed. He pulled the blanket to his chin. Also, he added toward the ceiling, if you could make sure Yun-suk doesn't do anything else, that would be good. I don't know exactly what she did, but I know she did something. I can feel it. He closed his eyes. You know everything. So you already know what I mean. He fell asleep. Outside his door, in the hallway, Valentina stood with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and her hand pressed flat against her chest where something enormous and aching and grateful was doing its best to stay contained. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to find her husband. She found him in the study. He was sitting at the desk with the letter in his hands, the one from his grandmother, the paper soft and slightly creased from being folded and unfolded too many times in too few days. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the doorway and watched him read it, watched his face move through something quiet and painful and necessary, and she waited until he looked up before she spoke. "You've been carrying something since the first night," she said. "I've been waiting for you to tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the letter down and said, "Sit with me." She sat across from him, not beside him, facing him, because whatever this was needed to be said face to face. He told her everything. The letter, the diagnosis, what Yun-suk had said on the first day, and what it had unlocked in him. The medical report his father had received when Nae-ji was 4 years old, the one that had been used to justify every decision that followed, the remarriage, the second family, the years of distance, the deliberate architecture of a life built around the assumption that Nae-ji could never be a father. And then, very quietly, he told her about the test. Valentina sat very still while he spoke. She did not interrupt. She did not fill the silences. She let him get to the end, let him place every piece on the table between them, and when he finished, she sat with it for a long moment before she spoke. "You tested our son," she said, "without telling me." "Yes. You had a question about whether he was yours, and instead of coming to me, you went alone." "I know. Look at me, Ji." He looked at her. Her eyes were steady and direct and entirely without performance, no tears, no theatrics, just Valentina, the most honest person he had ever known, looking at him the way she always looked at him when something needed to be said plainly. "I have never," she said, "been with anyone but you. Not once. Not in thought. Not in any moment of our marriage." She let that sit. "I know that doesn't fix the test result. I know the paper says what it says. But I need you to hear me say it, clearly, so it's between us and not just inside your head. Val, I'm not finished." Her voice was still level. "You should have told me. The moment you heard that word, that diagnosis, you should have turned around and told me. We are supposed to face things together. That is the only promise that has ever mattered in this marriage." She leaned forward slightly. "You don't get to protect me from things by keeping them from me. That's not protection. That's distance dressed up as love." He was quiet. "I'm not angry at you for doubting," she said, and her voice finally moved slightly, a small shift in the foundation of it. "I'm angry at you for doubting alone." He reached across the table. She looked at his hand for a moment, then put hers in it. "I was afraid," he said. "If the result was true, if it meant what it said, I didn't know how to look at you and ask. I didn't know how to say the question out loud without it becoming the kind of thing you can't take back. And now? Now our 6-year-old has organized 3 independent hospital tests and threatened to find me a replacement." He looked at her, and something in his face finally broke open, not painfully, but like something that had been sealed too long, releasing. "He told me to act accordingly." She laughed then. It came out slightly broken, slightly wet, the laugh of someone who has been holding too much for days and needed the release more than the joke. "He bought me a scarf," she said. "With my card." He had legal reasoning. He cited financial dependence. "He's 6. I know." Nae-ji's thumb moved across her knuckles. "He's going to be terrifying at 30. They sat in the quiet together for a while, hands connected across the desk, the letter between them, the city outside doing its indifferent, continuous thing. "The test was wrong," Valentina said eventually. "Not as an argument. As a statement." "I think so too," he said. "I just need the paper to confirm it. Then we do the 3 hospitals. We do it right." She squeezed his hand. "And when they all come back the same, you're going to look at our son and apologize. Not dramatically. Just honestly. The way you always do when you've gotten something wrong." "Yes. And then we figure out who orchestrated the original lie." His jaw tightened. "Yes. Together," she said. "Together," he said. The first hospital appointment was 2 days later. Valentina had chosen it herself, a private clinic in Mapo that had no connection to any name she'd encountered since arriving in Seoul. She had made the appointment under her own name, paid the deposit from her personal account, and told no one in the house except Nae-ji. Ri-so dressed himself for the appointment with unusual care. He wore his cleanest shirt, combed his own hair, and presented himself in the kitchen at 8 in the morning, looking like a small person attending something important. "You look like you're going to court," Valentina told him. "I'm going somewhere where the truth gets decided," he said. Same energy. At the clinic, while the nurse processed their intake forms, Ri-so sat between his parents in the waiting area with his hands on his knees and looked straight ahead. He did not fidget. He did not ask questions. He was entirely still in the particular way of someone conserving all available energy for what was coming. The test itself was simple. A swab. 5 minutes. Results in 48 hours. On the way home, Ri-so sat in the back seat and looked out the window at Seoul moving past him, the streets and signs and people he'd wanted to see his whole short life, and said quietly, "2 more after this." "2 more," Valentina confirmed. He nodded. Then he said, "Appa, when this is over, I want you to take me to see where Halmoni grew up. Your mother. I want to know about her." Neji, who was driving, was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because she's half of why you exist," Ri-so said simply. "And you're half of why I exist. So she's a quarter of me." He watched a market stall move past his window. "I want to know my quarters." Neji's hands tightened briefly on the wheel. Then he said, "Okay, when this is over." "Promise?" "Promise." Ri-so nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the city. The results from the first hospital arrived on a Thursday morning. Neji read them alone first, sitting at the desk in the study with the door closed and his phone face down on the surface and the single printed page in his hands. He read it twice. Then he put it down and sat with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes closed for a long moment. Positive. 99.99% probability of paternity. He sat with that truth and let it move through him slowly, not rushing it, letting it reach every place the doubt had lived, the cold places, the places he'd been trying not to look at for days. He let the certainty arrive in each one and replace what had been there. Then he picked up the page and went to find his son. Ri-so was in the courtyard with Yura, attempting to teach her a hand game of his own invention that appeared to have no consistent rules. Neji stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment, his son's hands moving quick and certain, his laugh when Yura got it wrong genuine and generous and entirely his own. "Ri-so." The boy looked up. He read his father's face in under a second, the way he always read everything, completely and immediately. He said something to Yura, slid off the bench, and crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of Neji and looked up at him. Neji crouched down, bringing himself to his son's level. He held out the page. Ri-so looked at it. He couldn't read the medical terminology, but he could read numbers, and the percentage at the bottom was unmistakable. He looked at his father's face. Neji said, "I'm sorry, Ri-so. I should have trusted what I already knew." Ri-so looked at him for a long moment. His face moved through something complicated, relief and hurt and love all arriving at the same time, and for a second the composure slipped completely, and he was just a 6-year-old boy who had been carrying something too heavy for too many days. Then he stepped forward and put his arms around his father's neck, and Neji wrapped his arms around his son and held him close, and neither of them said anything for a while. "2 more," Ri-so said eventually, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "2 more," Neji agreed. "Just to be thorough. Just to be thorough." Ri-so pulled back and wiped his face quickly with the back of his hand, recomposing himself before Yura could see. He straightened his shirt. He cleared his throat. "Also," he said, "you still owe Iyama an apology. The one you gave me was good, but hers needs to be better." He patted his father's shoulder. "Put some effort in. She's worth it." He walked back to Yura. Neji stayed crouched in the courtyard doorway for a moment, watching his son go, the paper still in his hand. The second and third hospitals returned identical results within the week. 99.99%. 99.99%. 3 independent institutions, 3 unconnected medical teams, 3 identical answers. It was on the evening after the third result arrived that Neji sat down across from his father and placed all 3 reports on the table between them, fanned out like evidence, which is exactly what they were. Naesung looked at them for a long time. The original diagnosis was wrong, Neji said. His father said nothing. Or it wasn't wrong, Neji continued, his voice completely level. It was made, deliberately, by someone who needed me to believe something false. He let that sit. I need you to tell me who gave the order. Naesung's eyes were still on the papers. His face held the expression of a man watching a structure he'd trusted his whole life finally, visibly, begin to fail. I believed the doctors, he said. I know you did. I'm not asking if you believe them. I'm asking who paid them. Silence. Appa. Neji leaned forward slightly. Riso spent a week praying every night that I would find out the truth. He's 6 years old and he carried this. He organized 3 hospital tests because he needed his father to stop doubting him. His voice stayed level, but underneath it something enormous was pressing. Tell me who. Naesung closed his eyes. From the hallway outside the study, a small sound. Almost nothing. Both men turned. Riso was standing in the doorway in his pajamas, bare under his arm, face very still. He looked at his grandfather. Then at his father. Then he walked in, climbed onto the chair beside Neji, and folded his hands on the table. Halabia, he said quietly. I'm not angry at you. I just need the truth. We all do. He looked at the old man steadily. Who did this to my family? The room was very quiet. Naesung opened his eyes. Naesung looked at his grandson for a long time. Outside, Seoul had gone quiet in the way it only did very late, the city pulling inward, leaving behind just the low hum of something continuous and indifferent. Inside the study, the 3 reports sat on the table between them, white and precise and damning. And Riso sat upright in his chair with his bear in his lap and his eyes on his grandfather, and the patience of someone who had already decided he was not leaving this room without an answer. Naesung said, it was Yun-suk. He said it the way people say things they have known for a long time and have spent that time refusing to look at directly, quickly, before the refusal could reassemble itself. Neji went very still. She came to me before we married, Naesung continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man lifting something he had set down years ago and was only now feeling the full mass of. She said the family doctors had found something in Ji's early blood work. A condition. She said they had confirmed it. She said she had spoken to them personally and reviewed the findings herself. He paused. I had no reason not to believe her. She was already involved in the family's medical administration by then. It was within her authority. Her authority, Neji repeated. She managed the household staff, including the medical team. Naesung's jaw tightened. I should have sought a second opinion. I should have questioned it. But he stopped. Looked at his hands. I was already in love with her. And she had given me an explanation that made sense of everything. Your mother's struggles. The marriage's difficulties. The question of inheritance. He looked up at Neji. I took the easy answer because the easy answer was also the one I wanted. You wanted a reason, Neji said. I needed one. His father's voice was barely above a whisper. What I was already doing needed a reason. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not the silence of forgiveness or understanding. It was the silence of a truth that had arrived too late to prevent damage, but was at least, finally, present. Riso, who had been listening with complete stillness, said, So she lied to you and you believed her because you wanted to. Naesung looked at his grandson. Yes. And my appa grew up thinking something was wrong with him. Yes. And then when we came here, she said it again. In front of everyone. On the first day. Riso's voice was entirely measured. She wasn't surprised to see me. She was ready. He looked at his father. She already had the story prepared. Which means she knew we were coming and she made a plan. Neji turned to look at his son. You called ahead, Riso said to his father. You told Halabia we were coming. Halabia told her. And she decided to use the old lie again. He set his bear on the table with the focused deliberateness of someone clearing space for something important. She wasn't protecting anyone. She was protecting herself. Because if the truth came out, everything she built on top of the lie would fall. Naesung stared at his grandson for a long moment. How old are you? 6, Riso said. But I've been thinking about this for several days, so I'm ahead of schedule. From the doorway, a sound. All three of them turned. Valentina was standing at the threshold with her arms crossed, and beside her, just behind her left shoulder, was Yun Suk. Valentina's face was completely composed. Yun Suk's was not. She had clearly been standing there long enough to hear the last several minutes of the conversation, and what was on her face now was not the calibrated pleasantness she had worn since their arrival. It was something rawer and more cornered, the expression of a person watching the exit narrow. Valentina said, I found her outside the door. Yun Suk straightened immediately, reaching for composure the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. I was coming to tell you dinner. The door was slightly open, Valentina said. She was listening. I was not. How long? Neji asked. Yun Suk looked at him. For one moment, just one, the mask slipped completely, and what was underneath it was not guilt exactly. It was something harder, something that had made its own peace with what it had done and only regretted getting caught. Then the moment passed, and she smoothed her expression back into place. Whatever your father has told you, she said, he is misremembering. I presented information I was given by the medical team. I was not the source of their names, Neji said. She blinked. What? The doctors. The ones who gave you the information. Their names. A pause. Short but visible. I don't remember exactly which. You managed the household medical team for 30 years, Neji said. You remember their names. Another pause. Longer. Riso watched her face with the focused attention he usually reserved for things he was learning. He was not angry. He was not performing anything. He was simply watching, cataloging, understanding the shape of a person who had decided a long time ago that the truth was optional when the lie was convenient. Yun Suk, Naesung said. His voice had changed. It had shed the apologetic heaviness of a few minutes ago and become something else, something older and colder and entirely finished with uncertainty. I have been making excuses for a very long time. I want you to understand that I am not making them anymore. She turned to look at her husband. Give him the names, Naesung said. The room waited. Yun Suk stood in the doorway of the study and looked at her husband and her stepson and her step-grandson and the woman she had been trying to quietly unmoor since the moment she arrived. And in her face was the particular stillness of a person calculating whether there was any version of this moment she could still control. There wasn't. She said 2 names. Neji wrote them down. He stood up from the desk and crossed the room and stopped in front of his stepmother and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has fully arrived at the end of something. Not furious. Not theatrical. Just done. I grew up believing I was broken, he said. I built my entire life around a diagnosis you manufactured. I almost lost my marriage because of it. My son spent a week praying every night for the truth you buried. He let that land. We are going to discuss what happens next, but not tonight. Tonight, I need you out of this room. Yun Suk held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she stepped back. Valentina moved aside to let her pass. She did not watch her go. Her eyes were on her husband. When the sound of Yun Suk's footsteps had faded down the hallway, Valentina came fully into the room and stood beside Neji. She didn't touch him yet. She just stood beside him, which had always been enough. Riso picked up his bear from the table. He looked at his grandfather. Halabia, he said. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about this. That's your business. He tucked the bear under his arm. But I want you to know that I don't hold what happened against you. You made bad choices, but you came here tonight and you told the truth when you didn't have to. He looked at the old man steadily. That counts for something. Naesung looked at his grandson with an expression that had nothing composed about it. Just an old man sitting with the accumulated weight of decades of cowardice, finally redistributed by a 6-year-old into something he could actually see clearly. Thank you, Naesung said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Riso said. Thank me when you've fixed it properly. He looked at his father. Both of you. He slid off the chair and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, as he always stopped, and turned back. Appa, he said. Neji looked at his son. You're not broken, Riso said. It was simple and direct and landed the way simple, direct things always land, completely, without defense. You never were. Someone just needed you to think so. He paused. I'm glad you know the truth now. I've been waiting for this for several days, and honestly, it's a relief. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Thank you, he said quietly, apparently to God, then looked back at his father. Good night. He left. The three of them who remained, Ne-ji, Valentina, and Ne-sung, sat with the quiet that followed, which was a different kind of quiet than the one before. Less like wait, more like aftermath. Then Ne-ji's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was from a clinic in Gangnam, the private one where he had taken his original test. He answered. The voice on the other end was a doctor, young-sounding, formal, speaking quickly with the particular cadence of someone delivering information they had rehearsed and were nervous about. He said that there had been an irregularity discovered in a batch of tests processed during a specific window. He said that a contamination issue in the sample processing had affected several results in ways that rendered them unreliable. He said that the clinic was contacting all affected patients and offering retesting at no charge. He said that Ne-ji's test had been in that batch. Ne-ji stood in the middle of the study with the phone at his ear, listening to the doctor apologize with the practiced sincerity of an institution managing liability, and he looked at Valentina, who was watching him with her arms crossed and her eyes steady, already reading the shape of the conversation from his face. So the result, Ne-ji said carefully. The negative result I received was affected by the contamination, the doctor said. We cannot stand behind it as accurate. We strongly recommend retesting. I've already retested, Ne-ji said. 3 times. Independently. A pause. And the results? All positive, Ne-ji said. 100%. 3 different institutions. Another pause, longer, and in it the doctor's relief was audible even through the formality. Then those are your accurate results, Mr. Ne. I'm deeply sorry for any distress the initial result may have caused. We take full responsibility. He hung up. He stood very still. Then he said, the test I took was contaminated. The result was wrong. Valentina uncrossed her arms. So every doubt you carried was built on a false result and a 30-year-old lie. His voice was entirely flat. Not from coldness. From the sheer volume of what he was processing. Valentina walked to him. She put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, and he closed his eyes and pressed into it slightly, the way he only ever did when he had run out of the energy required to appear fine. It's over, she said quietly. Not yet, he said. There are 2 doctors whose names I have. And a woman in this house who has not yet fully answered for what she did. Tomorrow, Valentina said. Tomorrow, he agreed. But tonight, he pulled his wife close and held her in the middle of the study with the city going quiet outside and the truth finally, completely, present in the room, and for the first time in 10 days he breathed without the weight of the doubt underneath it. Down the hallway, in the room with the light off and the bear positioned exactly upright on the nightstand, Riso lay in the dark with his eyes open and a smile on his face that nobody was there to see. I knew it, he whispered to the ceiling. I knew you'd come through. He rolled over, pulled the blanket up, and fell asleep in under 2 minutes. The morning came in slowly, the way mornings do after nights that have rearranged everything, light arriving without ceremony, indifferent to the fact that the people inside the house were not the same people who had gone to sleep. Ne-ji was already dressed when Valentina woke. He was standing at the window with his coffee, looking at the courtyard below where the early light was doing something quiet to the stones, and when she sat up he turned and looked at her with a face that had shed something, not the gravity, that was still there, but the particular isolation that had been sitting behind his eyes for days. He looked like himself again. The version of himself she had chosen, that had chosen her, clear and present and entirely hers. Today, she said. Today, he confirmed. She dressed. They went downstairs together. Riso was already in the kitchen. He had made himself toast, buttered it with concentration, and was eating it standing at the counter because he said sitting down for toast was unnecessary. He looked up when his parents came in and assessed them both with a single efficient glance. "You look better," he said to his father. "I feel better." "Good." Riso took a bite of toast. "Today is the day then?" "Today is the day." Riso nodded, satisfied, and ate the rest of his toast in silence, which was either respect for the gravity of the occasion or genuine focus on the toast. With Riso, it was genuinely difficult to tell. Neji had made 2 phone calls before breakfast. The first was to his company's legal team in Seoul, a firm he used for acquisitions and had never needed for anything personal before. They were thorough and fast, the way people are when they understand that the person calling them does not repeat himself. The second call was to a journalist, a woman named Seo Bit-na who had spent a decade investigating medical malpractice in private healthcare and whose recent work had been thorough and quiet and devastating in exactly the right sequence. He did not call either of them to be punitive. He called them because what had been done was not a private family matter dressed in complicated feelings. A child's identity had been weaponized. A man's understanding of his own body had been falsified by paid professionals. A woman had nearly lost her marriage to a manufactured doubt. These were not things that were resolved over dinner with an apology and a returned card. He sat down with Yun Suk at 9 in the morning in the study, with the door open and Na Sung present and the 3 hospital reports and the clinic's contamination disclosure on the table. Yun Suk had clearly been preparing. She was composed and dressed carefully, and her face held the particular readiness of someone who had spent the night building a defensive position. She had her own version of events organized, and she began presenting it immediately, measured and calm, the story of a woman who had received information from medical professionals and shared it in good faith. Neji let her finish. Then he said, "Dr. Pyo Sang-wook and Dr. Lim Cheol-jin." She stopped. "Those are the names you gave me last night," he said. "My legal team spent the early morning locating them. Dr. Pyo retired 4 years ago. Dr. Lim is still practicing." He paused. Dr. Lim received a call this morning. He was told that the original diagnosis records for a patient named Neji, dated approximately 30 years ago, were being reviewed as part of a medical malpractice inquiry. Another pause. He called back within 20 minutes. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked how much trouble he was in. Yun Suk's composure shifted fractionally. Just fractionally. But Valentina, who was standing near the door, saw it. "He told my legal team," Neji continued, "that the diagnosis was not based on clinical findings. That the documentation was prepared according to instructions received from a member of the Ne household administrative staff. That payment was made in cash, arranged through an intermediary, and that both he and Dr. Pyo had been told the purpose was to manage a complicated family situation." He leaned forward slightly. He used those exact words. Manage a complicated family situation. The room was very quiet. "You were 26 years old when you did this," Neji said. "My father had just lost his wife. You were already in the household. You were already planning what came after." His voice was not raised. It was not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who had already processed the rage and arrived somewhere past it, somewhere colder and more final. "You needed me unable to inherit. Unable to prove continuation of the family line. You needed me to believe I was broken so that when my father remarried and had other children, there would be no contest." Yun Suk said nothing. "And it worked for 30 years, he said. Until my son decided it was time for it to stop." From the doorway, down the hall, a small sound. Not Riso. Yura. The 16-year-old was standing in the hallway with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very wide, and beside her, Hyun, his face set in the expressionless way of a teenager who is feeling something enormous and has no architecture for it yet. Neji looked at his half-siblings. He looked at them for a long moment with the expression of a man who understands that the people in front of him are also, in a specific way, victims of the same deception, children born into a story that had been arranged for them before they arrived. "This is not about you," he said to them directly. "Neither of you did anything. I want you to understand that." Yura made a sound that was almost a word and pressed her hand harder over her mouth. Hyun said, very quietly, "We didn't know." "I know," Neji said. I know you didn't. Ne-sung stood up from his chair. He had been sitting through the entire exchange with the stillness of a man undergoing something he had accepted was necessary and was not going to flinch from. He looked at his wife, and in his face was something that was not anger, not in the way anger usually looks. It was something more thorough than that. The expression of a man who had loved someone for 30 years and was standing at the exact moment of understanding what that love had actually been built on. I have spent 30 years, he said, believing the story you gave me. I built everything after your story. I made decisions that cost my son his childhood understanding of himself. I let my first marriage's memory get buried under explanations that were never true. His voice was entirely level. I am not able to forgive that today. I don't know if I'll be able to forgive it at all. But I need you to understand that I know now. Fully. Without any remaining doubt. Yun-suk looked at her husband. And for the first time since they had arrived, her face held something unmanaged, something that was not calculation dressed as emotion but actual emotion, a complex, layered grief that might have been remorse or might have been loss, or might have been both at once. The grief of a person watching what they spent their life building finally come apart in front of them. She said nothing. She stood up. She left the room. The legal process that followed was not swift. It rarely is, but it was thorough. Dr. Lim's statement became the foundation of a malpractice inquiry that eventually drew in 3 other physicians who had been part of the household medical arrangement over the years. The financial trail was patient and specific, the way financial trails always are when someone has been careful but not careful enough. Seo Bit-na's reporting, published 6 weeks after they returned to Atlanta, was precise and devastating and asked no questions it didn't already have answers to. Neji did not attend the legal proceedings in person after the initial depositions. He had a company to run and a son to raise and a marriage to tend to, and he had learned from his grandmother, who had learned it from somewhere older and wiser, that justice and revenge were not the same thing and that the moment you confused them you lost access to the peace that came after. He wanted the peace. He went home. 2 weeks after they returned to Atlanta, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and coffee and the particular familiar warmth of a house that belonged to them, Neji came into the kitchen to find Ri-so sitting at the counter with a piece of paper and a pen, writing something with enormous concentration. "What are you writing?" Neji asked. "A letter," Ri-so said without looking up. "To who?" "God." He kept writing. "A thank you letter. I promised him one when everything worked out." Neji poured his coffee and leaned against the counter and watched his son write for a moment. The morning light was doing something good to the kitchen. Valentina was upstairs getting ready, and he could hear her moving around, the small domestic sounds of her presence that he had taken for granted for years and had spent 10 terrible days in Seoul understanding he could not afford to take for granted. "Ri-so," he said. His son looked up. "I owe you an apology." Ri-so set down his pen with the manner of someone giving an important conversation its full attention. He folded his hands on the counter. "Okay. I let fear make me doubt something I should have trusted. I let a paper tell me something that every other true thing in my life was contradicting. And in doing that, I made you carry something that was never yours to carry." Neji held his son's gaze. "You should never have had to organize hospital tests. You should never have had to negotiate for your father's belief." "I'm sorry." Ri-so looked at him for a long moment. His face moved through something that was very young and very real and entirely without the composed management he usually deployed. Just a boy looking at his father, taking in the apology the way something thirsty takes in water, completely. "Okay," he said again. "Then I forgive you." Simple. Without condition. Without the small performance of making someone wait for it. Neji exhaled. "Also," Ri-so said, picking up his pen again, "I want you to know that when I threatened to find Iyama a replacement husband, I didn't mean it. I know. I just needed you to feel the urgency of the situation. It worked. I know." He wrote another line. "I'm very effective." He looked up briefly. "But you're the only app I want. For the record." Neji looked at his son, This child who negotiated with God and threatened replacement husbands and cried alone in the dark where nobody could see and prayed with the focused urgency of a small lawyer who trusted the outcome before the evidence arrived. He crossed the kitchen, put his hand on Riso's head, and held it there. Riso allowed it for exactly the right amount of time. Then he patted his father's hand, the way he always did, in the direction that meant I've got it from here. Valentina came downstairs 10 minutes later to find her husband and her son sitting at the kitchen counter together, Riso finishing his letter, and Neji reading the newspaper, their shoulders almost touching. The easy proximity of two people who have come back to each other from a difficult distance and settled in. She stood in the doorway and looked at them for a moment. Riso looked up. Yama, your hair looks good today. Thank you, baby. It has the same energy as the Seoul scarf. He assessed her briefly. Powerful. Unbothered. He nodded. That's the one. She laughed and went to pour her coffee, and Neji reached out as she passed and caught her hand, and she stopped and looked at him, and he looked at her, and nothing needed to be said because everything had already been said, and the rest was just this: the morning, the coffee. Their son writing a thank you letter to God, the rain outside doing its quiet thing against the windows. This was the life. Not the drama in the mansion, or the confrontation in the study, or the 3 hospital tests, or the legal proceedings, or the 30-year-old life finally pulled into the light. Those were things that had happened to the life. The life itself was this kitchen, this morning, these two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and kept choosing, and this boy between them who had never doubted for a single moment that they were worth fighting for. Riso finished his letter, folded it carefully, and wrote on the outside in his careful 6-year-old handwriting, to God. Personal. Thank you for everything. From Ne Riso. P.S. You came through exactly on time. He placed it on the counter with the seriousness of someone filing an important document. Then he looked at his parents, both of them, together, in the same kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and something in his face went entirely still and entirely peaceful, the look of a child who has been working towards something for a very long time and has finally, completely arrived. Good, he said quietly, to no one in particular. Then he slid off his stool, picked up his tiger keychain from the counter, and said, I'm going to watch TV. Don't fight while I'm gone. I'll know. He walked out. Valentina looked at her husband. Neji looked at his wife. He'll know, she said. He always knows, Neji said. They stood in the kitchen in the morning light, and outside the rain had started properly now, steady and clean, washing the streets of everything that had accumulated. And inside the coffee was warm, and the letter was on the counter, and down the hall their son was already negotiating with the television remote with the same focused authority he brought to everything. Some families are built on blood and paperwork and the stories powerful people tell about themselves. This one was built on a 6-year-old who talked to God every night, a woman who refused to let fear turn into silence, and a man who had been told his whole life he was broken and had simply, stubbornly, continued to build something whole. The truth had taken 30 years to arrive. But it had arrived. And in the Ne household on a rainy Tuesday morning in Atlanta, that was enough. That was everything. Thanks for staying to the end of this story. Kindly like, comment, and share this video with your loved ones. See you in my next video. Love you all.